He stepped out of his car, rain slashing across the driveway, when a shadow darted through the iron gate. A girl, drenched barefoot, clutching a ragged toy, stumbled forward and dropped to her knees. Her lips trembled as she whispered a plea no one expected. "Please, sir, can I sleep in your dog's house tonight?" The millionaire froze his breath. Caught. He had faced ruthless rivals, billion-dollar deals, yet never words so small and piercing. What could drive a child to beg for a corner of shelter? His answer, uttered seconds later, would shake not only her world, but his own. If you want to know what happens next, stay with me until the end of the video. And if you still believe deep in your heart that God is always watching over you, silently arranging everything then right now, leave a comment saying Amen below this video. Because who knows, at the very moment you write those words, a blessing may quietly enter your life. The rain fell in sheets, thick and unforgiving, hammering the cobblestone streets of Newport. Wind howled down the alleys, bending trees and tearing loose the last of autumn's leaves. The kind of night where people stayed in lights warm behind drawn curtains, fireplaces crackling with comfort. But not everyone had a home to return to. A small figure darted through the storm, a girl no more than 7. Her dress clung to her skin, soaked through. Bare feet slapped the wet pavement, and in her arms she cradled a worn-out stuffed rabbit, the fur matted one ear, barely hanging on. Her face, pale and thin, was streaked with rain, and something else. Something older than a child should carry. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Away from the shouting, away from the hands that reached too quickly, away from a world that had never paused long enough to ask her name. Up on the hill, the Carter estate loomed like a fortress. Glass and stone, modern and magnificent. Lights glowed behind tall windows. A sleek black car was just pulling into the drive. Inside was William Carter Will to the world that feared and respected him. A man of 60 silver at the temples, tall and sharp-eyed. Billionaire real estate tycoon, known for his discipline, his solitude and his silence. He stepped out of the car, tugging his coat tighter against the wind, already planning the documents he'd review before morning. But before he reached the door, a voice stopped him. "Sir, can I sleep in your dog's house tonight? Just until the rain stops." He turned, startled. The voice was barely more than a whisper, but it cut through the storm like glass. There she was, a child standing just outside the hedge, shivering, soaked eyes, too large for her thin face. She hugged the ragged rabbit tighter. Her voice was small, careful, as if afraid he might yell. "I won't make a mess," she added quickly. "I promise." Will blinked. He hadn't owned a dog in his life. A dog would have been too much, too loud, too unpredictable. Everything about his home was orderly, curated, but here was this child asking for the smallest kindness he could imagine, shelter, not in his home, but in a doghouse that didn't even exist. "What's your name?" he asked. "Emily," she said, voice trembling. He crouched slowly, his knees stiff from years behind desks and in first-class flights. Up close, he saw the scrapes on her arms, the mud crusted on her hands, the way she seemed to fold in on herself as if apologizing for taking up space. "You can't sleep outside, Emily," he said softly. "Come in, just until you're warm." Her eyes widened. She glanced at her feet, the puddle forming beneath her. "But I'm wet." "I'll ruin your floors." "Floors can be cleaned." The door opened with a soft hiss, warm air spilling into the cold night. Emily stepped inside, hesitantly, each step leaving a small wet print on the marble. She looked up at the chandelier overhead, at the high ceilings, the gleaming staircase. Her mouth parted slightly in wonder, but she said nothing. Will stood quietly beside her, unsure why his chest felt so tight. He'd built this house as a monument to success. Every inch spoke of wealth control. But now, seeing it through her eyes, it felt empty. "My name is William," he said, his voice softer than usual. "You're safe here tonight." Emily said nothing, just hugged her rabbit tighter. She didn't thank him, not yet, and he didn't need her to. Some things went deeper than words. Outside, the storm raged on, but within the walls of the Carter estate, something fragile and new had begun to bloom. The storm had passed, but inside the mansion, its presence lingered like a shadow. Outside, the skies over Newport had softened to a pale blue, streaked with gold, where the sun pushed its way through. But inside the Carter estate, something far more profound had changed. The silence, once the pride of William Carter's carefully created world, now felt unnatural. Emily woke to the scent of lavender, faint and comforting, wafting from freshly laundered sheets. Her fingers curled instinctively around the stuffed rabbit nestled under her chin. For several long seconds, she lay still in the oversized bed, blinking at the ceiling, waiting for it all to dissolve like a dream. She was warm, dry, safe. That word safe was not something Emily had ever trusted. Safety had always been borrowed brief and followed by something sharp. She slid off the bed slowly, her feet sinking into the thick rug, and tiptoed to the tall window. The garden beyond glistened with dew. She stared at it as if she might wake up and find herself back in a damp alley. Downstairs, Will Carter was already awake. He sat in the kitchen, a French press beside him, reading a report he had no memory of requesting. He kept glancing at the grand staircase, listening for any sign of movement. And when the soft patter of footsteps finally came, he set the paper down and stood. Emily appeared in the oversized white shirt he had lent her the night before. Sleeves rolled up awkwardly, the hem brushing her shins. Her hair was damp and unevenly brushed, but she had made the effort. She hesitated at the entrance, eyes flicking between the marble floor and the polished table. "Morning," Will said gently. She nodded, clutching the rabbit to her chest like a shield. "I made breakfast. Nothing fancy, just eggs and toast." Emily stepped forward slowly, her body language like that of a wild animal, unsure whether it was safe to approach. She took the seat he gestured toward, but didn't reach for the food. Instead, she glanced up wary. "Go ahead," he said. "Eat as much as you like." She picked up a piece of toast and nibbled the edge, still watching him, as though waiting for the catch. Will busied himself with his coffee. He knew better than to push. Children like Emily didn't trust words, they trusted consistency, patience, quiet kindness. Halfway through the meal, he saw her slip half a slice of toast into the pocket of her shirt. It was so subtly done, he almost missed it. He didn't say a word. After breakfast, she followed him quietly around the house. She never asked where they were going, never wandered more than a few steps behind him. He showed her the study, the sitting room, the conservatory filled with plants he barely remembered owning. At each room, she would pause, take a few cautious steps inside, and retreat again, as if the beauty was something dangerous. When they reached the kitchen again, he opened the refrigerator. It was stocked with imported cheeses, fine wines, jars of sauces with names he couldn't pronounce. "What do you like to eat?" he asked. Emily shrugged. "Bread is okay." He blinked. "Just bread." She hesitated, then whispered, and maybe milk. That afternoon, Will made calls. He postponed meetings, cancelled a business flight to Zurich, and instructed his assistant to find a local boutique that could deliver warm clothes for a small girl immediately. By evening, Emily had her own toothbrush, a set of pyjamas, and socks that were far too fluffy to be practical. When she saw the pile of new clothes, she frowned in confusion. Are these for me? Yes. She ran her hand over a knitted sweater, the kind of soft she'd never touched before. But then she stepped back. You don't have to. Will crouched slightly to meet her eyes. You're here now. You need these. She nodded, but something in her face suggested she still didn't believe it would last. That night, he tucked her into the guest room again. The bed was so large that she looked like a doll lost among the pillows. Before turning off the light, she looked up at him. Is it okay if I sleep here again tomorrow? As long as you want, he said. Her eyes searched his face, and for the first time she whispered, "Thank you." Will stepped out into the hall, closing the door softly behind him. For a long moment he just stood there. The air felt heavier somehow, not with burden, but with responsibility, a kind he hadn't carried in years. The next few days passed in a rhythm unlike anything he had known. Emily began to speak more. She asked questions about the house, the paintings, even the sea she could see from the upper balcony. She marvelled at the bathtub, at the sound of music playing softly through built-in speakers, and once, when he showed her how the oven worked, she giggled for the first time. It was a small sound, but it filled the whole house. Will found himself changing too. He began ending work early. He took walks in the garden again, just so she would feel less alone. He ordered books with titles like How to Build Trust with Children and Trauma and the Developing Mind. At night, he found himself watching her sleep from the doorway, not out of worry, but wonder. One afternoon, as they sat near the window with mugs of warm cocoa, Emily turned to him. Why did you let me in? He looked at her for a moment, unsure how to answer. You asked, he said finally. And you needed help. Most people he knew would have looked away, pretended not to hear the voice in the rain. But he hadn't. Maybe something in him had been waiting for that moment all along. Emily leaned her head on his arm just briefly before sitting up again. I didn't think anyone would. And William Carter, man of silence, of logic of marble and glass, felt his throat tighten. Neither of them knew what would come next, but they both knew the world had changed the night she knocked on his heart, not his door. And in the days that followed, something soft had begun to grow fragile as a flower in winter, but real. Emily no longer asked for the doghouse, because now she was starting to believe she belonged inside. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the Carter estate, casting golden light across the marble floors. It was the kind of morning that promised peace, that whispered everything would be all right. But sometimes peace is just the stillness before a storm. William Carter stood at the doorway watching Emily tie the laces on a pair of borrowed shoes. They were a size too big, and she'd stuffed tissue in the toes to keep them from slipping. Her dress, though clean, hung unevenly, clearly meant for someone older. We'll fix that today, he said gently, handing her a small brush to tame her curls. New shoes, clothes that fit, a few things just for you. Emily looked up at him, eyes wide. We're going shopping, he nodded. In Milan. You need more than just shelter, Emily. You need dignity. She didn't quite know what that word meant, but something in his voice told her it was important. The car ride into the city was quiet at first. Emily pressed her nose to the glass, watching olive groves and distant hills roll past. She had never been beyond the alleyways of her old world. Everything she saw now felt unreal. Milan, she whispered when the skyline appeared. Her voice trembled like she was naming a fairy tale. William parked in a quiet district away from the crowds. He chose a boutique run by a kind older woman named Maria, who had dressed the daughters of ambassadors and queens, and now a little girl with hollow cheeks and careful hands. Maria didn't ask questions. She only smiled warmly and opened her arms. "You're safe here, Bambina," she said, her voice like music. Inside the shop, Emily walked slowly between racks of soft wool, cotton and silk. She hesitated to touch anything. William knelt beside her, pulling a soft blue cardigan from the shelf. "Try this," he said gently, slipping it over her shoulders. Emily stared at herself in the mirror. The girl staring back looked different, not like someone who lived in shadows, not like someone who had begged to sleep in a doghouse. "Pick what you like," William said. Her fingers lingered on a simple grey dress, then a pair of sturdy shoes. "These," she whispered. "They don't look expensive." "You deserve more than not expensive," he said, but she had already turned away, embarrassed. It was as they were leaving, 2 bags in hand, Maria waving from the doorway, that the world changed. Emily's smile vanished. She froze, dropping the small bag she carried. "They're here," she said. William turned. 3 men stood near a corner cafe, their bodies relaxed, but their eyes sharp as knives. One of them, taller than the others, with a beard and a long coat, lit a cigarette and locked eyes with Emily. "Behind me," William said quietly, stepping in front of her. But the men began walking forward, slow and steady, like they had all the time in the world. "Well, well," the bearded one said, his accent thick. "Didn't expect to see our little friend all cleaned up." William didn't flinch. "Keep walking." The second man laughed. "You think buying her a dress changes what she is. She belongs to us." The third added, "She ran out on her debts." "She's a child," William said, his voice like steel. "She owes you nothing." "That's not how the streets work," the bearded one spat. "Respect has a price." Emily clung to William's coat, her fingers digging in. He could feel her shaking. He pulled out his wallet. "Take this," he said, tossing a wad of euros to the ground. "It ends here." The men stared at the money, then at him. "We'll take it," the bearded man said, smiling, "but this isn't over." He leaned in close, just enough for William to smell the smoke on his breath. "She's worth more than this," he whispered. "And rats always find their way back to the gutter." Then just like that, they turned and walked away. Back in the car, Emily didn't speak. She curled into the corner of the seat, holding her stuffed rabbit tightly, her new dress wrinkled beneath her. At home, she refused dinner. She sat by the window, staring into the garden. "They'll come back," she said finally. "They always do." William sat beside her, silent. He had faced hostile takeovers, international lawsuits, and cutthroat negotiations, but nothing had ever made him feel so helpless. That night, he stayed up late pacing the study. He called his lawyer, then his head of security. He ordered cameras, locks, motion lights. He brought in private guards, but he knew. You can't always keep shadows out with locks. The next morning, Emily asked, "Can I still keep the clothes?" He nodded, kneeling beside her. "You can keep everything." "Emily," he said softly, "even me." She didn't respond, but for the first time she reached for his hand. The days after Milan carried a heaviness William could not shake. The men's voices lingered in his mind like smoke, their threat echoing every time Emily startled at a sudden sound. She had her new clothes, now soft sweaters, sturdy shoes, dresses, that made her look less like a ghost of the streets and more like the child she truly was, but the fear never left her eyes. At night, William would sometimes hear her stir awake, clutching the rabbit against her chest. He would pause outside her door, torn between knocking and letting her pretend she hadn't been afraid. He knew that feeling how shame clings to fear, and so he left her to her silence, though it hollowed him out inside. He tried to fight shadows with bricks and wires. Guards now patrolled the perimeter of the estate. Security cameras blinked red from every corner. New locks clamped down on the iron gates. But deep down, William understood men like the ones in Milan didn't need doors to break through. They lived in the cracks of the world where law and light seldom reached. Still, he had to try. For her. It was Clara Rossi, the social worker, who convinced Emily to leave the house again. Clara had visited often, her warm presence easing Emily's tension. She never pushed too hard, never scolded, never questioned too much. She simply sat with Emily, sometimes braiding her hair, sometimes telling stories of other children who had once been afraid but had found safe places at last. Just to check up, Clara said that afternoon, smiling as she held Emily's hand. Every child deserves to know they're healthy. We'll be home before Mr. Carter even notices we're gone. Emily looked to William. Her eyes, still uncertain, seemed to plead for reassurance. You'll be fine, he told her. Clara will keep you safe. And when you come back, we'll make hot chocolate. That made her smile small, but real. She nodded, clutching her rabbit tightly. William watched them drive away, unease and gnawing at his chest. He told himself he was being paranoid. That this was how normal life should be, school doctor's friends. She deserved that much. Still, he couldn't concentrate. The contracts on his desk blurred into meaningless lines. He kept glancing at the clock, waiting for the sound of the car returning. But when the phone rang and Clara's trembling voice broke through his world, shattered. They took her, she sobbed. William, they took Emily. His hand tightened around the receiver until his knuckles whitened. Tell me exactly what happened. Her words tumbled out, jagged with fear. They had just stepped out of the clinic. The sun was bright, the streets busy. And then a van pulled up, black windows tinted. The doors slid open and men rushed out. Clara tried to pull Emily back, but one shoved her hard against the wall. Another forced a folded note into her palm, while two more dragged Emily toward the van. She screamed his name, but it was lost in the chaos. They knew you, Clara whispered. They said you'd pay, or she'd disappear. William opened the note with trembling hands, 5 words scrawled in thick ink. 50,000, 24 hours. He crumpled it in his fist, his chest burning with fury and dread. He had faced billion-dollar deals, rooms full of enemies in tailored suits, but this was different. This was raw. This was personal. By dusk, the call came. Barcelona docks, the bearded voice drawled slow and taunting. Midnight tomorrow. Bring 100,000. Alone. If you want her breathing. William's throat tightened. If you harm her, the man laughed, a sound like gravel. If you're late, you won't have to worry about her anymore. The line went dead. Clara begged him to call the police. She wept, insisting they could track the men, that authorities could intercept the van. But William shook his head. He had seen enough of the world to know how quickly shadows scatter when sirens wail. They'll vanish with her, he said, voice low. I can't risk it. That night he stood in his study, staring at the duffel bag filling with cash. Each bundle of bills felt like a lie, proof that money could not solve what truly mattered. For the first time in his life, his wealth felt useless. He poured himself a drink but didn't touch it. His reflection in the glass looked older, heavier. He wasn't preparing for a business deal. He was preparing for a war. And in a dark warehouse near the sea, Emily sat tied to a chair. The ropes dug into her small wrists. Her rabbit lay discarded on the floor, its ear torn further in the scuffle. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, but her eyes, dark and steady, still searched the shadows. She whispered to herself, voice trembling but firm. "He'll come. He promised." The men laughed from the corner, their words dripping with cruelty. But Emily clung to that promise, to the memory of a voice that had told her she was safe. And William, pacing the silent halls of his estate, knew that this promise meant more than any contract he had ever signed. Tomorrow night, at the docks, he would either keep it or die trying. The drive to Barcelona was long and heavy with silence. The duffel bag sat on the seat beside William Carter, its weight pressing into him more than the steel of any gun. Inside was 100,000 euros in neat bundles. He had carried larger sums before across boardrooms, across oceans, but never had money felt so useless. This was no negotiation. This was a gamble with a child's life. The docks stretched like black skeletons against the midnight sky. Rusting containers towered on either side, their steel walls groaning in the sea wind. The air smelled of salt oil and something sharper fear. The headlights of his car cut across puddles, throwing shards of light against damp concrete. He killed the engine. The silence roared. "Over here, Carter." The bearded man stepped into view, flanked by two others. One held a knife loosely at his side, the other a length of chain. Behind them, under a flickering bulb, sat Emily, tied to a chair, her face pale, her hair tangled, her rabbit tossed carelessly on the ground. Her eyes lifted the moment she saw him. Relief sharp and bright broke through the terror. "Mr. Carter," she whispered, her voice cracking. William's jaw clenched. He wanted to run to her to tear the ropes from her wrists, but he forced himself still. One wrong move and they might hurt her. "You have the money?" the bearded man asked, his voice slick. William dropped the bag at his feet. It landed with a dull thud. "Release her." The man kicked the bag open. Bundles of bills spilled out neat and crisp. He whistled low. "Impressive. But here's the problem, Carter. Money doesn't change what she is. A rat is still a rat." William's voice was steady, though his pulse thundered. "She's a child. Let her go." The man grinned. "Oh, she's worth more than this little bag. You think we can't sell her pretty thing like a—" "Someone will pay double, triple." Emily flinched. But then, against all odds, she spoke. "You can't sell me," she said softly. The men froze, surprised by the sound of her voice. The bearded man sneered. "And why not little rat?" Her eyes, though brimming with tears, locked on his. "Because I know who you are." The words hung in the air. The second man shifted uncomfortably. "She's bluffing." Emily shook her head. Her voice trembled, but her memory was precise. "I heard you in Milan. You're Mark Riley. You live on Blossom Lane. You have a daughter. She goes to St. Francis School." The bearded man's smile faltered. His face drained of colour. "And you?" She turned to the thinner one, John Davis. "Your mother is in the hospital in Naples. She doesn't know what you really do at night." The silence was thick enough to choke. Even William stared, stunned. This small, trembling girl had taken everything she'd overheard, every detail she had tucked away, and turned it into a weapon sharper than any blade. You don't want me, Emily whispered, because I know too much. If I disappear, people will know where to look. The men exchanged frantic glances. For the first time, the balance had shifted. They had been the predators. Now somehow they looked like prey. Distant sirens wailed, faint but growing. The bearded man cursed, snapping the rope loose from Emily's wrists. "This isn't over," he spat. Then, with a shove that nearly knocked her from the chair, he bolted for the back exit. His men followed shadows scattering into the night. William rushed forward, gathering Emily into his arms. She clung to him with desperate strength, her small body shaking. "I knew you'd come," she whispered into his coat. He held her close, his throat tightening. "No one will ever take you from me again." The sirens grew louder until police lights bathed the dockyard in blue and red. Clara emerged from one of the cars, her face streaked with tears of relief. She had disobeyed his instructions, calling the authorities after all, and for that he would be forever grateful. The officers swarmed the warehouse, but the men were gone. Only the echoes of their threats remained, but Emily was safe. That was all that mattered. As William carried her toward the waiting car, she lifted her rabbit from the ground. Its ear dangled by a thread, but she hugged it fiercely as if saving it too. That night, as they drove away from Barcelona's port, Emily finally closed her eyes. For once, sleep came not from exhaustion, but from relief. William looked out at the sea, endless and dark, and felt something he hadn't known in years, clarity. This child was not just someone he had rescued. She had rescued him too, pulled him out of a life of marble walls and empty victories. This was no longer about charity, no longer about obligation. It was about love, about family, and William Carter, billionaire, solitary man of iron, realized he would fight the shadows of the world for as long as he lived, if it meant protecting the little girl who had once asked only for a doghouse. 6 weeks had passed since that night on the Barcelona docks. The Carter estate no longer echoed with silence. Instead, laughter floated through its halls, footsteps pattered across polished floors, and the once sterile rooms carried the marks of daily life. A soccer ball left in the corner, a sketch taped to the refrigerator, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table. Emily had changed. Her cheeks held colour. Now her hair caught the light in soft waves, and the haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by something William hadn't thought he would ever see: hope. She was still shy, still careful with her words, but she laughed more. She asked questions. She dreamed. And William changed too. He no longer worked until midnight in his study. He walked Emily to school, helped with her homework, learned to listen to the stories of her day. In her presence, he rediscovered pieces of himself he thought long gone. The day of the adoption hearing arrived in Paris. William dressed in a dark suit, his hands uncharacteristically unsteady as he adjusted his tie. This was not a boardroom. This was not a contract. This was family. Emily appeared in a pale blue dress, the very same one she had once admired in the shop window but never dared hope for. She twirled nervously, her rabbit tucked under one arm. "Do I look all right?" she asked, eyes searching his. "You look perfect," he said, kneeling to her height. "Absolutely perfect." In the courtroom, sunlight spilled across tall windows, illuminating rows of polished benches. The judge, a stern-looking woman with kind eyes, listened patiently as William explained his intentions. Papers were presented, signatures collected. But the moment that mattered most came when the judge leaned down to Emily. "Where do you wish to live, child?" Emily's voice trembled, but her answer was firm. "With Mr. Carter," she said. Then after a pause she added, "With my dad." The word hung in the air like a blessing. William's throat tightened. He let the tears come this time. Within the hour, it was official. Emily Carter, his daughter. Even Evelyn, his sister, who had once protested bitterly, was there. She looked at the girl, then at her brother, and for the first time she softened. She bent to hug Emily and whispered, "Your family now." Back in Newport, the estate slowly transformed into a home. The most unexpected change came one quiet evening when Emily tugged William into the garden. Beneath the oak tree where months ago she had stood trembling in the rain, a small wooden structure had been built. A doghouse painted white, surrounded by flowers Emily had planted herself. On the front, a small plaque read, "For every child who ever needed shelter, and for those who have found it." William knelt beside her, his arm around her shoulders. His voice broke as he whispered, "You asked me once for a doghouse, but you gave me something greater." Emily leaned into him, smiling through misty eyes. "You gave me a home." "No," he said softly. "You gave me one. You gave me family." As the sun dipped into the horizon and the first stars appeared, William Carter understood the storm that had brought Emily to his doorstep had not been a curse, but a gift. It had torn down walls he didn't know he'd built and filled his life with the one thing he had always lacked: love. And sometimes love begins not with grand gestures, but with the smallest of questions whispered in the rain. Can I stay? Today's story comes to an end, but its echo still lingers in the heart. What do you think? Give us a score from 1 to 10, and feel free to share a few words in the comments. Every voice here is valued and heard. Before you go, let me ask you gently, are you doing okay today? If your heart feels heavy, let this place be a quiet corner where you can share and find comfort. See you again in the next bedtime story, where love and hope remind us that no matter how dark the night may seem, kindness will always prevail.